Authority is never given. It is remembered. The fluorescent lights in the third-floor HR suite at Voss & Klein Technologies hummed at a frequency that made everything beneath them look slightly ill. It was 4:47 p.m. on a Thursday in November, and Karen Driscoll, Senior Director of Human Resources, stood behind her mahogany desk with her hands clasped in front of her blazer like a woman who had rehearsed this particular posture in a mirror. She looked at the man seated across from her the way someone looks at a stain on upholstery. His name was Marcus Ellery. He wore a flannel shirt with a frayed collar and steel-toed boots that still carried mud from a job site he had visited that morning. His hands rested on his knees, still and open, and he had not spoken in nearly 40 seconds. Karen Driscoll slid a single sheet of paper across the desk and tapped it once with a lacquered fingernail, the sound precise and deliberate and final. "We've completed our review, Mr. Ellery, and the leadership team has determined that your position no longer aligns with the strategic direction of this organization," she said. "Security will escort you to collect your personal effects. You have 15 minutes. Marcus looked at the paper. He did not touch it. Two uniformed guards appeared at the doorway as though summoned by instinct, and they stood with their arms at their sides and their eyes on the carpet, because even they understood that something about this felt rehearsed in a way that made them uncomfortable. She did not know. Karen Driscoll, who had spent 11 years climbing from benefits coordinator to senior director of human resources at a company she believed she understood completely, did not know that Marcus Ellery held 41% of Voss & Klein's parent holding company through a blind trust his late wife had structured before her death. She did not know that the man she was firing with a 15-minute clock and a security detail was, in the most literal and binding legal sense, the person who owned the chair she was sitting in. Keep watching. Because 24 hours later, Marcus Ellery returned to that same building, walked into that same boardroom, and signed the termination papers. But they had Karen Driscoll's name on them, not his. But this story does not begin in an HR office. It begins 14 months earlier, in a kitchen in Ridgewood, New Jersey, at 6:14 on a Tuesday morning, when Marcus Ellery stood at the counter in a white undershirt and poured orange juice into a plastic cup with a faded unicorn sticker on the side. His daughter, Lena, sat at the table behind him with her backpack already zipped and her sneakers already tied, drawing slow circles on a worksheet she was supposed to have finished the night before. Marcus was 43 years old. He had gray at his temples that had arrived all at once, like weather. His hands were calloused from years of work he no longer needed to do but continued doing because it was the only language his body trusted. He drove a 2011 Ford F-150 with 212,000 miles on it. He carried $23 in his wallet most days, not because he lacked money, but because he had learned that carrying more invited questions he did not want to answer. His wife, Catherine, had died 3 years and 4 months before that Tuesday morning. She had been an intellectual property attorney who specialized in technology acquisitions, and in the final year of her life, while the cancer moved through her body with the patience of something that had already won, she had restructured every asset they owned into a blind trust administered by a law firm in Manhattan that Marcus spoke to exactly once per quarter. He did not tell anyone about the trust. He did not tell anyone about the 7 patents Catherine had helped him file during the early years of Voss & Klein, when Marcus had been a founding engineer who wrote code in a basement apartment while Lena slept in a crib 3 feet away. He did not tell anyone that the man the company had eventually shuffled into a mid-level facilities oversight role, because he had taken a leave of absence to care for his dying wife and no one had bothered to review what he had come back to, was the same man whose algorithms still powered 62% of their flagship product. He told no one because Catherine had told him not to. "Let them show you who they are," she had said on a Thursday afternoon in the oncology ward, with Lena asleep in the chair beside her bed and the monitors beeping in a rhythm that sounded almost like patience. "Then you'll know what to do." So Marcus showed up every morning at 7:15 in his flannel and his boots, and he checked HVAC systems and reviewed maintenance logs and sat in a cubicle on the second floor that smelled faintly of industrial cleaner. And every afternoon at 3:40, he left to pick up Lena from Ridgewood Elementary, and they drove home together in the Ford with the windows cracked, and she told him about her day in a voice that made the entire architecture of his hidden life feel worth maintaining. Lena was 8 years old. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's quiet. She did not ask why they lived in a modest house when other families had bigger ones. She did not ask why her father's truck made a sound like a cough when he started it in the cold. She asked once why he always looked at the company building for a long time before he walked inside, and Marcus had turned to her and said, "I'm counting the windows." She had accepted this without question. That was enough. By the following March, the atmosphere inside Voss & Klein Technologies had shifted in ways that were difficult to name but impossible to ignore. The company had grown from 300 employees to nearly 500 in 18 months, fueled by a Series D funding round that valued it at $1.2 billion. And with that growth came a particular species of institutional arrogance that settled over the leadership team like fog over a cold harbor. Karen Driscoll had been promoted twice during that expansion. She now reported directly to the CEO, a man named Terrence Gladwell, who had joined the company 4 years after its founding and who believed, with the absolute conviction of someone who had never been corrected, that he had built it. Karen modeled her authority after his, precise, impersonal, and calibrated to remind everyone in the room that proximity to power was not the same as possessing it. Marcus watched all of this from his cubicle on the second floor, where the maintenance reports stacked up in manila folders and the overhead light flickered every 9 seconds in a pattern he had memorized without meaning to. He watched Karen walk past his desk each morning without acknowledgement, her heels clicking a rhythm that sounded like a metronome set to the tempo of someone else's patience running out. There was one person who saw Marcus differently. Her name was Joan Okoro, and she had been with Voss & Klein since its second year of operation, back when the office was a rented suite above a dry cleaner and Marcus Ellery had been the one who interviewed her. Joan was now a senior systems architect, and she carried in her memory the very specific knowledge that the man everyone ignored in facilities had once rewritten an entire authentication protocol on a whiteboard at 2 a.m. while his infant daughter slept in a car seat on the floor beside him. Joan sat down across from Marcus in the break room on a Wednesday in late March, set her coffee on the table, and looked at him with the expression of someone who had been holding a question for a very long time. "How long are you going to let this go on?" she asked. Marcus turned his coffee cup a 1/4 inch on the table. "Long as it needs to." Joan studied him with the careful attention of a person cataloging something she was not sure she would see again. She had watched Lena grow from a baby in a car seat to an 8-year-old who sometimes waited in the lobby after school, drawing pictures of buildings in a composition notebook while her father finished his shift. Joan understood that Marcus's silence was not weakness. But she also understood that silence, held long enough, could become its own kind of wound. "Karen's been auditing your department," Joan said, leaning forward slightly, her voice dropping to the register people use when they are delivering information they wish they did not have. "She's building a case." She told Terrence that facilities oversight is redundant and that the role should be eliminated entirely to demonstrate fiscal discipline ahead of the next board review. Marcus looked at his hands, resting flat on the break room table. They were very still. "She doesn't know who she's auditing," Joan said quietly. "No," Marcus said. "She doesn't." That evening, Marcus picked up Lena at 3:42 from the school parking lot, 2 minutes later than usual because he had sat in the truck for a long moment with his hands on the steering wheel and his eyes on the gray November sky, thinking about a promise he had made to a woman who was no longer alive to hear him keep it. Lena climbed into the passenger seat with her backpack and her composition notebook and a smear of blue paint on her left thumb, and she buckled her seatbelt without being asked. On the drive home, she held up a drawing she had made during art class. It was a picture of a man standing in front of a very tall building, and the man was small and the building was enormous, and at the very top of the building there was a single window colored in yellow crayon. "That's your office," Lena said, pointing to the yellow window at the top. Marcus looked at the drawing for a long moment at a red light, and something moved behind his eyes that he did not let reach his mouth. "That's a good window," he said. She taped it to the refrigerator when they got home, next to a grocery list and a school permission slip and a photograph of Catherine that had been there so long the edges had begun to curl inward, like something trying to hold itself together. The following Monday, Karen Driscoll scheduled a formal review of Marcus's department. She requested access to his personnel file, his attendance records, and his original employment contract, A document that, had she read it carefully, would have revealed a clause granting him observer rights to any board meeting, a provision Catherine had insisted on during the company's founding year and that no one in the current leadership had ever bothered to examine. But Karen did not read carefully. She read the way people read when they have already decided what the document says. By Thursday of that week, Marcus received a formal notification that his role was under review for elimination, effective within 30 days. The letter was signed by Karen Driscoll and countersigned by Terence Gladwell, and it was delivered to Marcus's cubicle in a sealed envelope by a junior HR coordinator who could not meet his eyes when he handed it over. Marcus opened the envelope, read the letter once, folded it carefully along its original crease, and placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket, next to a photograph of Lena that he carried everywhere and a business card from the Manhattan law firm that administered his trust. He picked up his phone and made one call. It lasted 11 seconds. The termination meeting was scheduled for 4:30 p.m. the following Thursday, the same Thursday that opened this story, the same fluorescent-lit HR suite, the same mahogany desk where Karen Driscoll had perfected the geometry of professional dismissal. But the week that preceded it was the week that nearly broke Marcus Ellery, and it did not break him because of anything Karen Driscoll did, though she contributed her share of weight to the structure that pressed down on him during those 7 days with the slow, distributed patience of something designed to make a person question whether standing was worth the cost of remaining upright. On Monday morning, Marcus arrived at the office at 7:15 as he always did, and he found that his keycard no longer opened the door to the second floor. A building security officer, a young man named Deshawn who had always nodded at Marcus with the kind of respect that exists between people who work with their hands, stood at the elevator bank and explained, without meeting Marcus's eyes, that his access had been restricted to the first floor and the parking garage pending the outcome of the review. Marcus stood in the lobby for 11 seconds. He could feel Deshawn watching him from the periphery, and he could see, reflected in the glass doors that faced the street, the quiet shame on the young man's face. Because Deshawn understood without being told that the person standing in front of him had done nothing to deserve this particular humiliation, and yet the architecture of the institution required him to enforce it regardless. Marcus nodded once. He walked to the first-floor conference room that had been designated as his temporary workspace, sat down at a table designed for 12 people, opened his laptop, and began reviewing maintenance logs as though the morning had proceeded exactly as planned. On Tuesday, the situation moved in a direction Marcus had not anticipated, and it was this movement that constituted the first of 2 crises that would test everything he had chosen to endure. Karen Driscoll sent a company-wide email announcing a realignment of operational priorities that included the elimination of the facility's oversight function and a carefully worded suggestion that the department had been underperforming for an extended period due to what she called leadership deficiencies. The email did not mention Marcus by name, but it did not need to, because everyone in the building understood that facilities oversight was a department of one, and that the one was the quiet man in the flannel shirt who always left at 3:40 to pick up his daughter. Joan Okoro called Marcus at 12:17 that afternoon. He was sitting in the first-floor conference room with his lunch, a peanut butter sandwich and an apple, packed that morning while Lena ate cereal at the kitchen table, and asked him whether clouds were heavier than buildings. "Marcus, the email is gaining traction," Joan said, and her voice carried the particular tension of someone who is angry on behalf of another person and working hard to keep that anger from becoming the loudest thing in the room. "People are talking. Some of them are saying you must have done something to warrant this kind of public action from Karen." Marcus set down his sandwich. He looked at the cold gray light coming through the conference room window, and for a long moment he said nothing, because the sentence forming in his chest was not one he trusted himself to speak without the weight of everything behind it becoming audible. "Let them talk," he said. But that night at home, with Lena in bed and the house quiet in the way that only a house with one adult and one sleeping child can be quiet, a silence that has texture and weight and a particular quality of aloneness that is different from loneliness but adjacent to it, Marcus sat at the kitchen table and stared at the business card from the Manhattan law firm and considered, for the first time in 3 years, whether Catherine's strategy had been wrong. Whether patience, deployed past its natural lifespan, became something else entirely. Not dignity, but erosion. Whether absorbing injustice without response was, at some point, no longer an act of strength but an act of slow disappearance. and whether disappearing was something he could afford when there was an 8-year-old girl asleep down the hall who needed him to remain visible and present and solid in a world that had already taken everything else from her. He sat with this for a long time, and his hands rested on the kitchen table. And the house was cold because he had forgotten to adjust the thermostat, and the silence asked questions he did not try to answer. On Wednesday morning, the day before the scheduled termination meeting, Marcus was summoned to a preliminary session with Karen Driscoll and a company attorney named Bryce Wellerman, a man with a shaved head and a Swiss watch who spoke in sentences engineered to sound reasonable while containing nothing of substance. Wellerman informed Marcus that, as a professional courtesy, the company was prepared to offer a severance package of 4 weeks' pay and continued health coverage for 60 days, contingent upon his signing a non-disparagement agreement and a full release of all claims. Karen Driscoll sat beside Wellerman with her hands folded and her expression arranged into something she apparently believed resembled empathy. "We want to make this transition as smooth as possible for you, Marcus," she said, leaning forward with the practiced sincerity of someone who has delivered this particular sentence many times before. "We understand you have a daughter, and we want to be sensitive to the fact that this change will affect your family situation." Marcus looked at her steadily, his jaw tightened by a single degree, a movement so small that only someone who knew him well would have recognized it as the physical manifestation of a man choosing, with deliberate and enormous effort, not to speak the sentence that had assembled itself behind his teeth. "I'll think about it," he said. He drove home that afternoon through a cold gray rain that made the Ford's windshield wipers work harder than they were designed to, and when he picked up Lena from school she was quieter than usual, sitting in the passenger seat with her composition notebook closed on her lap and her eyes fixed on the road moving beneath them. They ate dinner in near silence. Grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, the meal they defaulted to on evenings when neither of them had the energy for anything more complicated. After dinner, Lena settled on the couch with her notebook and Marcus sat beside her, and for a long time neither of them spoke. The television was off. The house made its small, settling sounds around them. The tick of the radiator, the hum of the refrigerator, the wind against the windows that faced the backyard where Catherine's garden had once grown and where now there was only grass and the memory of color. Lena shifted closer until her shoulder pressed against his arm, and she opened her notebook and began to draw, slowly and with great care, a picture of two people standing side by side. She did not explain it. She did not ask what was wrong. She simply drew. And her presence beside him on that couch was the only argument against disappearance that he needed or would ever need. Marcus made a second call to the Manhattan law firm at 9:47 that evening, after Lena was asleep. This call lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. When it ended, he set his phone on the kitchen table and looked at the drawing Lena had taped to the refrigerator, the man and the tall building and the single yellow window at the very top, and for the first time in a week, something in his chest that had been braced against itself finally released its hold. His hands, resting on the table, were no longer still. They were steady. There is a difference. At 4:47 p.m. on Thursday, Marcus Ellery sat in the chair across from Karen Driscoll's mahogany desk and listened to her read his termination statement in a voice that carried the practiced neutrality of someone who had fired enough people to develop a cadence for it, a rhythm designed to make the act feel procedural rather than personal, institutional rather than chosen, inevitable rather than deliberate. She slid the paper across the desk. She tapped it once with her fingernail, the same sound as before, precise and final. The two security guards appeared at the door. Marcus looked at the paper. He did not touch it. "You have 15 minutes to collect your personal effects," Karen said. "Security will accompany you to ensure a smooth transition." Marcus stood. He lifted his jacket from the back of the chair. He walked through the doorway, and the guards fell into step beside him with the uncomfortable compliance of men participating in something they could not fully evaluate. And Marcus Ellery moved down the third-floor corridor and into the elevator and out through the building's glass front doors at 4:53 p.m. on a Thursday in November, carrying nothing but his jacket and the photograph of Lena pressed against his chest in its inside pocket. He drove to Ridgewood Elementary. Lena was waiting on the bench outside the main entrance with her backpack and her composition notebook, and when he pulled up in the Ford she looked at him with an expression that was not surprise and not worry but something closer to the quiet recognition of a child who has learned to read the temperature of a room before she walks into it. "Early today," she said. "Yeah," Marcus said. They drove home through streets that were beginning to gray at the edges as the afternoon moved toward evening, and Marcus did not explain, and Lena did not ask, and the silence between them on that drive was not empty. It was the particular silence of two people who have learned to trust each other with the things that cannot yet be said. At 4:51 the following afternoon, exactly 24 hours and 4 minutes after Karen Driscoll had tapped that paper with her fingernail, a black sedan pulled into the parking lot of Voss & Klein Technologies and discharged 3 individuals onto the cold November pavement. Diane Soto, senior partner of the Manhattan law firm Kaufman, Soto & Breck, a forensic auditor named Raymond Chu who specialized in corporate governance structures, and a notary public who carried a leather portfolio containing documents that bore Marcus Ellery's signature as majority stakeholder of the Ellery Family Trust, which held 41% of Voss & Klein's parent holding company, Breck Halford Ventures. Diane Soto was 61 years old. She walked into the Voss & Klein lobby with the unhurried authority of a person who has never needed to walk quickly because the outcome is never in doubt, and she presented her credentials to the front desk in a voice that carried the quiet, terrifying precision of 30 years spent ensuring that the law did exactly what her clients needed it to do. She requested an immediate meeting with the full executive team, the head of human resources, and the company's general counsel. By 9:30 that morning, as Marcus sat at home with Lena, who was drawing at the kitchen table while the radio played low in the background, the 7th floor boardroom at Voss & Klein Technologies was full. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the executive team had reviewed every document in Diane Soto's portfolio. By 3:15, Bryce Wellerman had excused himself from the room twice. By 4 o'clock, Terrence Gladwell had stopped speaking entirely. At 4:47 p.m., the exact hour of the previous day's termination, Marcus Ellery walked through the front doors of Voss & Klein Technologies for the second time in 24 hours. He wore the same flannel shirt. He carried no briefcase. Lena walked beside him, her composition notebook pressed against her chest, because it was a Friday and there was no school, and because this was not a moment he was willing to move through without his daughter beside him. The boardroom on the 7th floor was very quiet when Marcus stepped inside. Terrence Gladwell sat at the head of the table with the expression of a man who has been informed that the building he believed he owned has always belonged to someone else. Karen Driscoll sat 3 seats to his left. Her hands were no longer folded. They were pressed completely flat against the surface of the conference table, fingers splayed, as though she needed the solid weight of the mahogany to confirm that the room was still real. She looked at Marcus when he entered, and in the moment her eyes found his face, something shifted in her expression that moved through several recognizable stages in rapid succession. Confusion, recalibration, and then a slow, full comprehension that arrived not like a revelation but like the final piece of a picture she had been assembling without knowing she was assembling it. Joan Okoro sat near the far end of the table with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and she watched Marcus cross the room with an expression that was not shock, because she had known, but something closer to the specific, physical relief of a person who has been carrying a weight on behalf of someone else and has finally, after a very long time, been permitted to set it down. Diane Soto placed one final document on the table. She set it directly in front of Marcus, who had taken the seat at the center of the table. Not the head, not the foot, but the center, which in a room like this communicated more than either end could have. She placed a pen beside the document and stepped back without a word. It was a termination authorization for Karen Driscoll, Senior Director of Human Resources, effective immediately. Signed by the controlling stakeholder of the parent holding company, whose name, it turned out, was Marcus Ellery. Karen's hands pressed harder against the table. Her shoulders rose toward her ears in a slow, involuntary contraction, and she stared at the document with the expression of a person who has just understood that the floor beneath them has been glass the entire time. Marcus looked at the document. He looked at Karen. He picked up the pen. She found her voice from somewhere thin and remote. "I didn't know," she said. "I didn't know who you were." "I know," he said. "That was the point." He signed his name. Lena stood near the doorway watching her father's hand move across the paper. She did not understand every dimension of what was happening in that room. The legal architecture, the trust structures, the precise weight of the documents on the table. But she understood what she saw. Her father, standing in a room full of people who had just discovered what she had always known, writing his name in the place where it had always belonged. He did not cheer. She did not speak. She pressed her composition notebook a little tighter against her chest, and she watched her father's hands. Steady, certain, and completely still in the way that only a person who has nothing left to prove can ever truly be still. 6 months later, Marcus Ellery sat on the back porch of a new house in Ridgewood, larger than the old one, but not by much, because he remained the kind of man who measured a home by who was inside it rather than by what surrounded it on the outside. Lena sat on the porch steps below him with her composition notebook open across her knees, drawing in the late spring light that turned the backyard grass a shade of green that felt almost unreasonable in its generosity. He had been reinstated to the Vossen Klein board of directors within 1 week of the signing. He did not take a corner office. He did not move to the 7th floor. He returned to the 2nd floor, to a workspace near the east-facing window, because the morning light came through it at an angle that reminded him of the kitchen in the old house where Catherine used to stand with her coffee and her legal briefs and her absolute certainty that patience, deployed with precision and protected by love, was the most quietly devastating force a person could carry through a life. Joan O'Caro came to the house on a Saturday afternoon in late May, and she sat on the porch with Marcus while Lena drew pictures in the yard below, and Joan watched the child for a long time in the comfortable silence of someone who knows that some things do not need to be framed in order to be understood. "You know what Catherine would say right now, don't you?" Joan said. It was not quite a question. Marcus looked at his hands resting on his knees, still and steady in the warm afternoon light. Joan smiled at something she was seeing in her own memory. She'd say, "The people who underestimate a quiet man always speak the loudest the moment they find out who he is." Marcus watched Lena in the yard below, her dark eyes focused on her page, her small hands moving with the slow, deliberate care of someone who already understood, without being taught, that the most important things are built carefully, without announcement, in the quiet spaces that other people do not think to look. There is a question this story leaves in the room, and it does not have a clean answer, only a human one. When someone in authority wrongs you and you hold the power to stop it immediately, is it more courageous to act at once or to wait, knowing that the cost of waiting falls heaviest not on you, but on the child who depends on you to remain standing? Sit with that. Let it stay uncomfortable. The best questions always do.